Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's Festival of Literature. It is an absolute delight for me and our team to welcome Amit Baishya. Welcome, Amit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and thank you.
Uh,
It's a big
a, lit-
honor. Mhm.
a little bit about Amit.
Mhm.
Amit Baishya is an associate professor of English at the University of Oklahoma and the book reviews editor of South Asian Review. He is the author of contemporary literature from Northeast India, Death Worlds, Terror and Survival, published by Routledge in 2018. He recently completed his second monograph, Attunement to Others, Multi-Species Cohabitations in the Anthropocene. He has co edited two books, Northeast India, A Place of Relations, published by Cambridge, UP in 2017, and Post-Colonial Animalities, published by Routledge in 2019. He has also co-edited two journal special issues, Planetary Solidarities, Post-Colonial Theory, The Anthropocene, and the Non-Human, published by Post-Colonial Studies in 2022, and Insights Outsides Northeast Indian Anglophone Literature by South Asian Review, published in 2023. Baishya has also translated Debendranath Acharya's novel on the forgotten Long March from Burma during World War II, Jangam, the movement, the movement, Vitasta 2018, from Assamese to English. So, welcome, Amit.
Thank you very much, Sabine. As I mentioned, it's a big honor to be invited to give a keynote. And I've been looking at your lineup. It's fascinating. I just wanted to briefly preface my talk, and I'll be speaking largely from a PowerPoint, but this is a kind of new work that I'm doing on weird fiction from the global south. So while the list of authors that I deal with is longer than what I'll be talking about, what I'll be focusing on specifically are political affordances of the weird for the global south. And here I want both to talk about the way in which weird fiction kind of deals with questions of national history, but it also deals with questions of the Anthropocene and climate change. So I'll be talking specifically about three novels: Rita Indiana's Tentacle, which is from the Dominican Republic; The Light at the End of the World, which is by Siddhartha Deb, which was published last year, which is based on India; and then, of course, Babu Bangladesh by the late Numair Atif Chowdhury, published in 2019, which is about Bangladesh again, right? So I'll just switch over to the PowerPoint. If I'll just try to do it myself. I guess I'm the host, right? Yes. Do you see my screen? And
It's
then,
opening up, yes.
yeah, okay. And I'll just do the slideshow.
Yeah.
Just a second. Okay, so let me begin. The title of my talk today is Post-Lovecraftian Fiction and the Political Affordances of the Weird for the Global South. Now, the novels that I mentioned earlier could be definitely read within a Lovecraftian strain, but they have a lot more. But just for the purpose of the talk, I'm trying to kind of focus more on H.P. Lovecraft, the hugely influential and controversial writer of weird fiction. And the novels that I kind of am working on, the first one is by Rita Indiana. This is from the Dominican Republic, published in 2015, translated from Spanish by Achi Obejas. And the title of the novel is Tentacle. I'm not going to talk about Jawbone that much. It is by Monica Ojeda, who is a Ecuadorian novelist, and it was translated by Sarah Booker from Spanish to English into 2023. The ones that might be more of interest to folks in South Asia: The Light at the End of the World, Siddhartha Deb, of course, deals with contemporary India 2023, and then Babu Bangladesh by the late Numair Atif Chowdhury, Bangladesh, again, to 2019. So let me begin first of all by clearing the ground. What is the weird? And how are Lovecraftian themes reworked and weird and inverted both in the new weird and the weird from the global south? When I say new weird, I include writers like Victor LaValle, Jeff Vandermeer and China Mieville, and they are also people who have kind of engaged with Lovecraftian themes but inverted them in interesting ways. And we'll talk a little bit about these inversions before we go to the specificity of the weird from the global south. So, what's a weird? A kind of simple definition of this is that the weird is a hybrid genre, which is an amalgam of science fiction, horror, and the gothic. Mark Fisher, in his book The Weird and the Eerie, defines the weird as opposed to the uncanny. The uncanny is that which signifies the other within, while the weird refers to some visitation from the outside. But what I've been trying to argue, of course, is that the weird, and this is not just me, there are a few other people who have been arguing about this, is the weird is a particular generic vehicle which is useful for understanding the Anthropocene. Therefore, as a marker for the Anthropocene, I would categorize the weird as an affect, a genre, and a mode. Now, let me go through these three dimensions. The first is affect, right? The literary critic Jeffrey Weinstock delineates the modern adjectival sense of the weird in terms of the bizarre, the odd, or the unusual, and the Old English sense of weird as a noun signifying an agency, power, or entity that predetermines events. The first is evident in the weird atmospheres in weird novels, and the second chimes with Mark Fisher's definition. Although in the modern weird, a definitive agency that predetermines events may be absent. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the weird also appeals to a branch of philosophy called non-correlationism, right? Which includes people like Quentin Melassu, Graham Harman, and others. And here the idea is basically, or Eugene Thacker, the idea is being adrift in a universe where human centrality is no longer there, but you're also in a universe where there is an agency outside, but you do not quite know what that is. So that kind of remains mysterious. So at the level of affect, that's what the weird is. At the level of genre, I already spoke about the generic hybridity of the weird earlier. It is sci-fi plus gothic plus horror, so it's a weird kind of amalgam of different genres. And then finally, I would like to think about mode. I was writing my review of Deb's novel in 2023 when the wildfires were going on in New York City. Um, and there was a meme which was going around, one which showed the World Trade Center covered by water.
There's a bit of lag sometimes.
There's a bit of a lag. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the connection part of it, then probably. But uh, could I keep on continuing, or should I go back on certain things?
There's like no, there was just like a less than a second. It comes
Okay,
and then but just
and then it
wanted to
goes away.
flag that.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I noticed that when you were talking
Yeah.
as well. So, let's hope we can do it, and in case we can't, we'll try to figure out how to do that. So anyway, to get back to the talk, there was this meme which was going around, which compared New York City 2023 to a still from Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049. And it's the same kind of orange glow, the broom, kind of going over the city, so to speak, in some ways. And that's one way in which one could think about the weird, where futuristic scenarios come into the present moment. So, in a way, the Anthropocene is weird. And very recently, I had this interview with Siddhartha Deb published in public books, and I'm going to read out a segment that I wrote on that. And I write, but the weird is also a mode for reading the depiction of the Anthropocene in novels like The Light at the End of the World. I tried to capture this mode via double articulation. The air and Deb's novel is literally about air because it starts with New Delhi and its AQI, is metaphorically and literally weird. Nature too is ruined and available for reading as ruins, just as Mark Fisher argues in The Weird and the Eerie that the weird is an intrusion from the outside. Siddhartha Deb whose novel is both about Delhi and about Bhopal, deems that the apocalyptic gas leak on December 2nd, 1984 in Bhopal, India is an alien visitation. Now, when the smokeocalypse hit New York City in late May 2023, there were memes that compared New York City, the city of broom, juxtaposed with a shot of the hazy atmospherics of Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049. And I would argue that maybe the Anthropocene is best described as weird, and maybe the vanguard of representing the weird Anthropocene are novels like The Light at the End of the World. So, let me just reiterate that I'm using the weird in three ways. The first one is as an affective scenario. The second one is as a genre. And the third one is as a mode of reading the Anthropocene and climate change. And this I will use to talk about the three novels that I have and that I'll discuss later on in this talk. But let me get back to Lovecraft. Why Lovecraft? He's a controversial author, first of all. A lot of people who know Lovecraft know that while he's influential, he's also very racist, anti Semitic, and sexist as well. And his politics are kind of all wrong in a way, right? But there are certain features of his which are reworked, especially by progressive writers. The first one is cosmic horror. The second one is the appearance of tentacles. And the third one is what Lovecraft calls non-Euclidean architectures. And all three of them will be reworked in the three Global South novels, as we'll notice. So let me go through some of these features, right? First is tentacles and horror, right? And the unexpected haptic touch of the tentacle, right, of any tentacular being makes the skin crawl. Tentacles seem alien because they appear wavy, slimy, multitudinous, and formless. They seem limb-like, but not quite, possessing sufficient degree of similarity with our hands, but with radical differences. In the context of the weird, weird writer China Mieville, the Marxist writer, writes that touch and touchability are central to the weird tactility of the tentacular. Weird aesthetics depends on haptos, little to do with human somaticism, and everything to do with the horror of matter. This is from his essay on M.R. James. The weird, he also says, is radicalized sublime backwash, as everyday corners, for instance, could transmogrify into portals for the entrance of tentacular haptos. And in fact, you see this quite a lot in Lovecraft, especially in The Call of Cthulhu, which is probably his most famous story. Here's an example of weird haptos in a novel which borrows somewhat from the weird without being weird in some ways. This is Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island, and this is when the protagonist, Dean, with his friend, his Italian polymath friend, Giacinta, is walking through, Venice and, near the canals. And he says, we watched in horror as a mass of squirming shipworms came pouring out of broken logs. They fell on the pier and came swarming towards us. I grabbed Chinta's arm. Run, run. But the worms were all over the pier now. We had taken only a few steps when Chinta stepped on them and slipped. I tried to catch her. We both fell onto the planks. And then the worms were swarming over us, our legs, arms, faces, heads. It was as though the earth itself had set tentacles to touch us, to feel the texture of our skin, and to see whether we were real. And again, this is not a weird novel, but it definitely brings in some weird aesthetics about the tentacle. Notice it is as if the earth itself had sent out tentacles to touch us, a planetary, to feel the texture of our skin and to see whether we are real. So I would say that the weird and this weird aesthetic, especially about the tentacle, comes up in interesting moments, even in non-weird novels like Gun Island. Let's get to the second dimension, which is non-Euclidean architecture, which is, I'm going to read a portion out from The Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansson, one of the characters in the story, achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city. For instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces, surfaces too great to belong to anything proper or right for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mentioned his talk about angles, and this is italicized because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unlettered seaman felt the same thing whilst gazing at that terrible reality. In fact, in Lovecraft and a lot of his successors, we walk through these non Euclidean architectures. Corners, very often, become sources of horror because corners become portals to, let's say, the abyss outside or worlds outside. Tentacles come out from there, or you get into another place, so to speak, in some sense. German Expressionism, of course, used that a lot in its kind of visual renderings. If you watch the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for instance, their two corners are the ones that lead to madness, so to speak, in some sense. So I would like us to keep this aspect of non-Euclidean architectures in mind, because especially in Siddhartha Deb and in Numair Atif Chowdhury, we walk through national architectures, we walk through corners, and it is through that more emancipatory dimensions come. While in Lovecraft, corners are portals to the horror beyond. In novels of the global South, weird walking through these corners can often lead to the light at the end of the world. But we'll come to that later on. So, horror in Lovecraft often arises out of suggestion, not description. If you go back, for instance, think about it. I mentioned his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non Euclidean. So, Lovecraft never quite describes things, he simply suggests, he piles on the details, in fact, and sometimes in such a way that people like Edmund Wilson have actually critiqued his purple prose as well. But these suggestions are also sites for an unexpected haptos as tentacles emerge from some beyond. Finally, I'd like to go to cosmic horror and human insignificance. This is a quotation from his other story, Color Out of Space, just to kind of make a distinction of Lovecraftian aesthetics. This is towards the end of the story, right? After this object that comes from outside, which is an alien color. Again, think about Mark Fisher's definition. The weird is something that comes from outside. It's an alien visitation of some sort. It comes from the outside, right? And in coming from the outside, it kind of changes and mutates reality. There's a movie with Nicolas Cage recently, which also kind of updates the story, Color Out of Space, right? Then I'm going to quote a segment from it. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Ami described could be called a gas. Again, think about the suggestion. But this gas obeyed laws that are not of our cosmos. There was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories. There was no breath from the skies, whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure or deem too vast to measure. It is just a color out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all near nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extracosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. And for folks who have read the story, you note that the color eventually seems to go away, but there is always this suggestion that something remains lurking, for instance, in these woods in New England. This color out of space, this thing that comes from the outside and you cannot quite explain, right? It comes from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extracosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. So these three dimensions. One, of course, cosmic horror and human insignificance. The second one is the tentacle. And the third one, of course, is this idea of, let's say, walking or these scenarios of walking through non Euclidean architectures are elements that will be reworked both in the new weird and as well as in the global south weird. But let me begin first of all with the new weird and how a group of writers, progressive writers, for instance, rework Lovecraftian ethics, right? Here's Victor LaValle. Sorry, this is Jeffrey Weinstock, the critic on cosmic horror. He says the weird tale, what Lovecraft defines as the literature of cosmic fear, undercuts post Enlightenment rationalism and posits instead the coexistence of other worlds and supernatural forces. The true weird tale, Lovecraft writes, goes beyond Gothic conventions to suggest a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguards against the assaults of chaos and demons of unplumbed space. Dread, provoked by the suggestion that humankind is insignificant and adrift through a cold universe of the unimaginable, and often malign powers and forces, is the milieu of the Lovecraftian weird tale. So let's think a little bit about reworkings. The first one, I would say, is the new word writer. This is Victor LaValle, Puerto Rican writer who inverts one of Lovecraft's famous stories, the horror at Red Hook, in his wonderful novel The Ballad of Black Tom. Now, the reason I'm kind of talking about this as well, there's a reworking of the horror of Red Hook, I would argue, also in Numair Atif Chowdhury. So I'm going to talk about Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook. The story is infamous for Lovecraft's racist depictions. We'll come back to the Yazidis later, but here's a representative passage which kind of shows his racism. The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and other elements impinging upon one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American bells lying not far distant. It is a babel of sound and filth, and sends out strange cries to answer the lapping of oily waves at its grimy piers and the monstrous organ litanies of the harbor whistles. And I continue from the same story, Horror at Red Hook. From this tangle, and this is Lovecraft, by the way, from this tangle of material and spiritual putrescence, the blasphemies of 100 dialects assail the sky. Hordes of prowlers reel shouting and singing along the lanes and thoroughfares. Occasional furtive hands suddenly extinguish lights and pull down curtains, and swarthy, sin-pitted faces disappear from windows when visitors pick their way through. Policemen despair of order or reform and seek rather to erect barriers protecting the outside world from the contagion. And this contagion for Lovecraft is a racial contagion, right? This is, of course, set in New York. Now, this is how Victor LaValle rewrites this in The Ballad of Black Tom, which is a rewrite of this story. The perspective in this novel shifts to the African American Tommy Tester, who realizes later, when faced by the racist NYPD, that in Lovecraft, and I quote here from The Ballad of Black Tom, a fear of cosmic indifference suddenly seemed comical or downright naive. He saw the patrol cars parked in the middle of the road like three great black hounds waiting to pounce on all these gathered sheep. What was indifference compared to malice? So it's a reworking, one could say, of Lovecraft's racist aesthetics, right? Through, of course, centering, for instance, the African American character named Tommy Tester, who's a minor character in the story, but becomes kind of like the center. And here, police violence is seen to be far more horrific, so to speak, right? White police violence is seen to be far more horrific than all this cosmic indifference and all that crap, right? Anyway, this is also a point, and I'm just going to put this up while I won't talk about this. In Jawbone 2, there's a wonderful chapter which talks about the horrors of whiteness, right? This is Monica Ojeda, where Monica Ojeda rewrites both Lovecraft and the famous chapter from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is the whiteness of the whale. I won't talk about it too much, but maybe if we want to talk about it during the Q&A, we'll talk about that more. What I'd like to do, though, is to move to another kind of inversion in the new weird, and this comes from Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. His partner Anne and Jeff Vandermeer write that the weird can be transformative, sometimes literally, entertaining monsters while not always seeing them as monsters. It strives for a kind of understanding even when something cannot be understood, and acknowledges failure as sign and symbol of our limitations. So this is the transformative potential of weird horror. The best example of that, obviously, is in Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, which was made into this movie starring Natalie Portman a few years ago. At the beginning of this novel, as a group of scientists goes into this place called Area X, a mysterious zone which is expanding and where people mutate into to be part of the natural surround, the scientists come across a creature they call the crawler. And at that point, the word uncanny comes up in this particular fashion. This is in page 69 of the novel. We were scientists trained to observe natural phenomena and the results of human activity. We had not been trained to encounter what appeared to be the uncanny. However, as the novel goes on, in Annihilation, the inadvertent inhalation of a fungal spore leads to a sensory and bodily transformation of the unnamed female protagonist in the mysterious Area X, as the protagonist slowly and painfully comes to terms with her sensory corporeal mutation towards the novel's closure. We come across this resonant sentence, and notice how the question of the uncanny is reversed here, right? Imagine that this communication between the mysterious beings in Area X sometimes lends a sense of uncanny to the landscape because of the narcissism of our human gaze, but that it is just part of the human world here. Because of the narcissism of our human gaze, go back to that previous quote, the weird can be transformative, sometimes literally, entertaining monsters while not always seeing them as monstrous. It strives for a kind of understanding, even when something cannot be understood, and acknowledges failure as sign and symbol of our limitations. In this reworking of the uncanny, we notice, for instance, how a certain sense of anthropocentrism, or what we can call human centrality, is completely inverted when when the character after her mutation says, "Imagine that this communication sometimes lends a sense of the uncanny to the landscape because of the narcissism of our human gaze, but that it is just part of the natural world here." This is how the new weird writers, the progressive writers, have talked about, for instance, rework Lovecraft's very problematic politics, very conservative as well as right wing and also very racist politics, but use some of the Lovecraftian tropes to actually explore, so to speak, some of the kind of antinomies of our current moment. With this, I'd like to go to introduce the weird in the global south. Siddhartha Deb actually has a wonderful essay in The Nation called The Shadow over H.P. Lovecraft, which I would strongly suggest people could read as a kind of way of working with and against Lovecraft. But from my interview with him, I quote him. This is my interview in the public books, which just came out earlier this month. The tentacles and also the wings and angels in his novel are my ways of writing against Lovecraft. For him, what lies outside the weird is the source of horror, is the source of his racist patriarchal fear of the other. But for me, especially in The Light at the End of the World, it's exactly the opposite. What lies outside the weird, the subconscious, our dreams, our fantasies, the monster, the alien, these are actually possible sources of liberation. And notice the kind of echo from what Vandermeer and Jeff Vandermeer say, that the weird can be transformative. It strives for a kind of understanding, even when something cannot be understood, and acknowledges failure as sign and symbol of our limitations. I think there's an elective affinity between these comments as well. So, on that note, let me talk about the three novels and what's common in these three novels, which is why I chose to speak about them today, right? Tentacle, The Light at the End of the World, and Babu Bangladesh, right? Narratively, they deal with both the deep past and the speculative future. They are novels about climate change and the Anthropocene. The weird, like I said, becomes a descriptor for that. They relativize national history, whether it's Dominican Republic, whether it's India or Bangladesh, within longer time frames of planetary history. And then finally, tentacles, wings, and portals function as possible lines of flight from the iron cage of the nation form. So let me elaborate by going through these three novels. They also hybridize the Lovecraftian world, weird, with the affirmative and emancipatory dimensions of localized traditions, worldviews, and mythologies. And just to give a few examples that I'll discuss, there's the use of Santeria in the Tentacle, right? The Afro-Caribbean, religious and cultural practice, which is also known as Obeya and Wudun. There is the figuration of the Al-Burak, the winged steed that takes the that transports the Prophet Muhammad in the light at the end of the world. And there's of course the influence of the Yazidis in Babu Bangladesh, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to read the Horror at Red Hook by Lovecraft a little bit differently at the end. And I'm just going to cite a few quotations from interviews with the writers. This is Rita Indiana. In an interview that she gave at the Yale Climate Center, she writes, "The Dominican Spanish I used to write all my novels in is a language in constant evolution. Especially in its street form, new words and idiomatic expressions are invented constantly. I'm overwhelmed by this extreme creativity, which also says a lot about the culture and psychology it springs from. The Yoruba I use in Tentacle is the one used in the Afro-Cuban Santeria, orally transmitted prayers, songs, and myths that arrived in the Caribbean during the slave trade and that for a long time survived in the heads of practitioners. This is the hybridization I was talking about, where more localized systems of belief and worldviews are kind of fused with the Lovecraftian weird. This is Siddhartha Deb. When I asked him a question about angels, he replied, I probably embraced angels because I refused to see Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or the Marxist messianism of Walter Benjamin, as alien to my traditions. They're a part of my world, even if angels aren't part of Indic, Hindu, and Buddhist traditions. But like the tentacles, angels began showing up in my fiction, and I was perfectly happy with that. Unfortunately, no interviews with Numair Atif Chowdhury, who tragically passed away. He drowned in Japan in 2019, just prior to the release of his book. But here's a comment by one of his editors, Rahul Soni. Babu Bangladesh is more than just a novel about Bangladesh, which it is also gloriously comprehensively is. In the same way as 100 Years of Solitude is not about Macondo, Babu Bangladesh is also not a novel about nations, how nations form and work, about political idealism and corruption, about capitalism and its perils, about not losing sight of one's roots and culture and history, about art and architecture, about our planet and what humankind has reduced it to. I could go on and on in what it aspires to be. This is a novel about everything. And here's my comment as a gloss to this. Everything includes beliefs of indigenous groups like the Hajongs, Manasa Devi snake worshippers, Beres or snake handlers and their beliefs and practices, the speculative history of migration into the subcontinent, including the Yazidis. So, one of the ways of thinking about the global south weird is also through this lens of hybridization. It's not purely magic realism in the way we understand it. It is the way in which the Lovecraftian weird is also kind of hybridized, syncretized, if one were to put it, with these kind of multi-faith ideas or cultural practices that exist in the Dominican Republic, in India, or for that matter, in Bangladesh. So let me go to Tentacle. This is Rita Indiana's Tentacle, translated by Achi Obejas and published in 2015. Tentacle technically has three time frames in which it operates. The first is the deep time and planetary history. The Caribbean here, and I'm quoting from the novel, is depicted as the dark side of the planetary brain. There's a 500-year history of colonization and post-coloniality, including the period of Spanish colonization of what is now the Dominican Republic, and the bloody dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo and Joaquin Balaguer. And then, of course, there's a speculative climate change future where a major catastrophe has led to the wipeout of most species in the ocean. Climate change. It is, of course, a novel about climate change. I teach it in my climate change class as well. In this speculative future, in the 2020, a massive biochemical spill has occurred, turning the Caribbean into a dark and putrid stew. Marine wildlife has been completely wiped out in this novel. But it is also a time travel narrative. And there are three different timelines in the novel. The late 2020s, where the trans protagonist, a shield, works for the Santera Esther Escudero. There is 1991, where a shield's double, the white Giorgio Menicucci, travels to prevent a biochemical spill from happening in the future, and the period of colonialism in the 1500s, where the protagonist is Roque, another split self of a shield that travels back in time. So I'll talk a little bit about the ritual through which the splitting of the self happens. But the point is that they're the same person. A shield in late 2020s, you have Giorgio in 1991 and Roque in the 1500s, and they seem to work in parallel, unspooling in the head of this same character who splits into three, right? So this is the complex kind of narrative technique which is followed in this particular novel. What is the agency of transformation? The agency of transformation is the Condylactis gigantea, which is the ball anemone, a species commonly found in the Caribbean Sea, but also highly endangered. And as you notice, right, it seems like it has multiple tentacles. So let's get back to Lovecraft again, right? The anemone's tentacles, when the novel opens, the Santera Esther has one of the last Condylactis gigantea in her possession, signifying the cataclysmic biodiversity loss. Remember that The biochemical spill has killed almost all species, but the Santera has one of the last kind of sea ball anemones in her possession. However, the ball anemone serves both as a tentacular substitute to Lovecraft and a portal to 1991 and 1500 for Achille. Achille, Giorgio, and Roque travels back to 1991 through a portal opened by the anemone's tentacle. So it is actually shown in the novel that there's a portal which is opened up to the past, and you have the trans character referred to as she who has a gender change and then moves, for instance, to the past as this white man called Giorgio, right? So the tentacle becomes the vehicle of transformation. As Achille completes his desired gender transformation, Achille is referred to as she at the beginning and he after the transformation. Through futuristic pharma technology, Esther's assistant, Eric, his name is Eric Whittier, uses the anemone and its tentacles to assist in the transformation through a Santeria ritual. And I'm going to quote from the novel. The new Achille, and remember that now he's turned male, still dazed, asked Eric what he was doing when he saw him. With a sporadic pulse, writing symbols on floors and walls. Startled with a sudden fervor, Eric bought the anemone out of the jar. Acting as the priest now, Eric began to pray in a sharp and nasal voice. And I would like you to this is in Yoruba, but I'd like you to focus on the name Olokun. As he prayed, he joined the tentacles to the moles on Achille's head. The tentacles stayed put as though with Velcro, and the creature's smell supplanted the neighborhood's garbage stink, transporting Eric back to Matanzas Bay. The silver lights, the sunset moving on the water, and a strong smell of iodine and algae infused him with the vigor he needed to finish the ritual. Olokun, here is your child. Omo Yamaya. He even got closer to the ear of the newborn man and used his last breath to let him know. Esther knew what was going to happen. We gave you the body you wanted. And now you have given us the body we needed. So the whole time travel narrative is that Achille travels back to 1991 as this white man named Giorgio to prevent that catastrophe from happening, right? So he's sent back from the future to the past to prevent that catastrophe from happening. But queerness in this text is not only represented through centering the trans character, but also through Yoruba cosmology, right, where the Orishas, Yemaya, and Olokun are often represented as androgynous. But there is also the representation of indigenous Taino beliefs. While the Orishas and Yoruba cosmology obviously come from the Afro-Caribbean heritage, right? The Tainos, a lot of whom were actually killed in the genocide by Spanish colonialism, but it kind of continues on to this moment in the present, right? And we'll talk about queerness as probably a counter-hegemonic viewpoint. Here's Olokun, the deity of the ocean, androgynous, associated with a shield. And here's Yemaya, another Orisha associated with motherhood, fertility, and the sea, who's associated with the Santera Esther Escudero. So I'm quoting here from Sherry Descartes and Kirsten Orloff's essay, The Ones Who Came In From the Sea, a brilliant essay on this novel, where they talk about the oceanic weird in this novel. Within the novels, and I quote, within the novel's mythos, Afro-Caribbean and Tainoian beliefs provide counter-hegemonic viewpoints to coloniality and neoliberalism. When Achille is first reborn as Giorgio in the submarine doorway, he is welcomed by Taino characters Nenuko and Anani, who herald him as one of the men of the sea, descending from the earth of the beginnings. In the mythology of the Taino, for whom fishing was an integral aspect of life, fish and water are central. The supreme spirit, Yaya, creates the world by emptying the contents of a calabash, which contained his son's bones transformed into water and fish. The animist Taino view of the natural world differs profoundly from the capitalist view of nature. It is a perspective grounded on the continuity of relationships between all things, natural and cultural. In this view, the transformation of form is crucial to the interactions between beings, each assuming a form appropriate to the relationships in which it's engaged. The novel's evocation of Taino beliefs is thereby invested with the prospect of an alternative to the impoverished Cartesian paradigm of nature as external to humanity. So it obviously both the Afro-Caribbean decolonial viewpoint as well as what you would call the indigenous viewpoint, offer counter hegemonic viewpoints to, let's say, a more impoverished neoliberal colonial present. The Tainos are also present in two other dimensions in the novel: the presence of the unnamed Taino in the colonial narrative in 1500. And then there's, of course, the androgynous Taino pot that recurs as a motif throughout the novel. A Taino pot, the heart shaped piece with a phallic growth emerging between two breasts. This is from page 35 of the novel. Both indigeneity and queerness offer counter hegemonic viewpoints, right? And it represents an outside, like Deb mentioned, to the contemporary impoverished neoliberal present. However, these emancipatory dimensions are foreclosed when Achille decides to stay back as the white cisgender male Giorgio in 1991 without changing the future that he was tasked with changing. And this is what Rita Indiana says about the transformation or the metamorphosis of Achille and Giorgio. The real science involved in the processes of people in transition that people in transition go through amazes me. I'm also interested in the idea shared by many religions of being born again and the special powers that come with it. However, Achille's most important supernatural power is not time travel, but the privilege bestowed upon her as a white heterosexual male. In fact, there's an outside in this novel, but it is foreclosed because Achille wants to keep, or Giorgio wants to keep, in some sense, the privilege of a white heterosexual male at the end of the novel and does not change the past, which eventually changed the future as well in the novel. So let me move from Tentacle now to The Light at the End of the World, right? Again, a novel which was published last year. I'll do the same thing I did with, and which is one of the reasons why I compare these three novels. It has three time frames, right? It has deep time and planetary history. One of the primary means of representing this are cephalopods. It is a 200-year history of colonization and post-colonization. The novel moves from near future Delhi back to 1984 Bhopal to 1947 to 1859, again to the near future Andamans. And it is also a representation of the degradation of the atmosphere and its impact of breeding, represented both by the connection between Bhopal and that night in Bhopal and the AQI, or the Air Quality Index, in near future Delhi, right? Let's think a little bit about the tentacle again, right? To think about its reversal in Deb. While it is not a multi-species novel per se, Deb's novel also plays with the semiotic reversibility of tentacular beings. At the beginning of the novel, the tentacular erupts into the story space as a Thulu-like herald from some abyssal beyond. As near future Delhi is enveloped in an impenetrable broom caused by natural and unnatural factors such as pollution and toxicity, the female Muslim protagonist, Bibi, she is the protagonist of the first and the last half of the novel, seem to discern giant faces in the fog, eyes wide open in surprise, tentacular limbs flailing in the air. But as the novel progresses, cephalopods become capacious heralds of deep time, and ancient monsters that extend vast cephalopodic slippers, holding unending stares with giant lazy eyes that are filled with compassion and mystery. The novel ends with Bibi adrift in the Andaman Islands, a topography that has become a locus for exploration of deep time in the subcontinent. In a direct reference to Anthropocene time, Dave's novel ends with Bibi's eyes recognizing the compassion of cephalopods that came before and remain after. They gesture to a planetary temporality that precedes and will outlive the human. Human time is but a blip in a larger schema of planetary time. So this is how the tentacle gets reversed in the light of the end of the world. But the novel is also about air. In my review of the novel in the Telegraph, I tried to capture this mood via double articulation. The air in Deb's novel is metaphorically and literally weird. Nature, too, is ruined and available for reading as ruin. Just as Mark Fisher argues that the weird is an intrusion from the outside, Deb, in one of his essays in Twilight Prisoners on Bhopal, deems that the apocalyptic gas leak on December 2nd, 1984, in Bhopal is an alien visitation. This leak, moreover, is an act of unparalleled atmoterrorism, a term by the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. Atmoterrorism captures how elemental substances like air are changed by lethal elements like gas in the epoch of the Anthropocene. But atmo-terrorism need not only be an exceptional event like Bhopal 1984, but also banalized quotidian index of slow violence. Delhi's air quality, as we know, is routinely listed as one of the worst in the world, a reality extrapolated out in the novel to a possible future Delhi with an AQI of 689 and rising. While indices like AQI allow us to visualize that air, the same air manifests in the body as well in the novel. The persistent coughs that individuals and populations suffer from in the novel and in reality. So it is both a novel about deep time through cephalopods, and it is also a novel about the Anthropocene in the way in which we change an elemental substance like air. But it is also a novel about weird walking and lines of light. And here, the key element that comes up is in the first part of the novel when Bibi is working through Shankar's Doll's House Museum in Delhi, which is mentioned in the novel as one of the utopian projects of the Nehruvian era, the ruins of the third world. But it is now presented as a non Euclidean space. As Bibi walks around corners, right, she seems, in some sense, to be opening herself to portals from the beyond. Finally, in this first part of the novel, she comes to the extreme end of Shankar's Dolls Museum. It's the Andaman exhibit, and the light from the end of the world literally seems to emerge from there. So, this is what Deb says on architecture in his conversation with me. All of this extends to my understanding of architecture, to the corner as a border in the micronation of an oppressive building. In a novel, there are corners and borders everywhere. People slip through doors and corners. They take unexpected turns at corners. They try to find an escape from the neo-Spearian oppressive architecture of Modi's Hindu right Delhi, from the neoliberal architecture of shopping malls and airports, and from the British colonial architecture that came before, from the violence of class and caste and gender and ableism, from the repressed histories of violence and displacement. In Lovecraft, the architecture that is oppressive is often alien, non Euclidean, non Enlightenment, or non Western classical. But in my work, we are the ones who have created these architectures of oppression, these architectures of violence, like the detention center being built in Assam, or the prisons in Pune or Delhi, where dissidents and activists like the BK-16 are imprisoned under concocted charges. And in fact, this also goes with the Union Carbide building in Bhopal, which where the Hindu fundamentalist assassin who is the protagonist of that particular segment walks through this kind of non-Euclidean structures of, let's say, the UCI building just before the gas leak. So that's the connection also with Bhopal. However, in the last page of the novel, and this is the real inversion of Lovecraft to a global Southland, in an unnamed island in the Andamans, as Bibi looks up into the sky, in front of her, the darkness seems to dissolve and shape itself into a giant cloud blooming over the sea, shining suddenly with a momentary vivid underglow. The cloud has a face, a body. Its eyes stare in dismay, its mouth is open. Vast wings are spread out behind to catch the immense storm. This is clearly a reference to a segment which serves as an epigraph to the novel, which is from Walter Benjamin's Nine Theses of History, which is based on Paul Klee's famous Angelus Novus. And this is, of course, the Nine Theses of History. The angel of history must just look so, his face is turned towards the past, where we see the appearance of a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet. He would like to pause for a moment to awaken the dead, but his wings are caught in that storm coming from paradise and drives him irresistibly to the future, to which his back is turned, while the rubble heap before him grows sky high. That which we call progress is this storm. Right? And in fact, this is the epigraph to the novel. He ends with that, although he also hybridizes it with another recurring motif, which is that of the Al-Burak, right? And this is the continuation of the passage. Bibi lifts her head to see if she can find the moon. Eyes on a peacock's tail, the compassion of cephalopods that came before and will remain after. Wing beats of angels, hoof beats of the Burak, and vast alien familiars whirling against a blaze of stars against the sky. And here's the Burak, of course, as we know in the Islamic tradition, is the flying steed of prophets upon which the Prophet Muhammad rode on his nighttime journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. So, in a way, let's get back also to Deb's comment that that while angels and flying beings of let's like the Burak may be foreign to, let's say, Indic, Hindu and Buddhist traditions, it's also a kind of way of laying claim, so to speak, about angels from other traditions and thinking, for instance, about emancipatory ideas of transcendence in this novel. And that's the way in which the novel ends. This is also similar, and I'd like to go to my last novel, which is Babu Bangladesh, right? Again, written by the late Numair Atif Chowdhury, published in 2019. Like the other two novels, it has three timelines. It has the deep history of the Bengal Delta. It's a time of the Bangladeshi nation, roughly 1971 to 2027. And it also begins in 2727 with the climate change future, where refugees from Bangladesh have moved elsewhere. So it begins in 2027. Again, the same gesture. It begins in the future, works its way back to the past. But weird walking, how does that operate here? Here, the first part of the novel is called Building, and it's based on the Jatiya Sangshad Bhaban, which is, of course, the famous kind of monument built by Louis Khan in association with Mizarul Islam, right? Which began when Bangladesh was still East Pakistan, was finally completed in 1982. The narrative structure is complex. It's presented as an incomplete, non chronological biography of a fictional character called Babu Mozumdar, completed in 2028. Its main source is few of Babu's diaries and essays given to the quote unquote biographer by a fishmonger much after Babu's disappearance in 2012, and he mysteriously disappears as a bird. Subsidiary sources, people whom the charismatic Babu was in touch with, as well as techno-mediated forms like video and audio recordings, and several narrative digressions on deep time, on subcontinental history. There are also footnotes, where the author or editor provides various forms of historical, literary, mythical, and also personal information. So it's a complex narrative structure. And the five parts of the novel are called Building, Tree, Snake, Island, and Bird. This is after the preface by the editor come author of this book. How does national history get weirded? Carl Friedman argues that weird fiction is fundamentally inflationary in tendency, aiming to suggest reality to be richer, larger, stranger, more complex, more surprising, and indeed weirder than common sense would suppose. And here's a quotation from Babu Bangladesh. For one thing, this project is a perfect gateway to the examination of obscure and alternative narratives pertaining to Bangladesh. Babu, intentionally or not, was implicated in affairs that require us to explore rare and institutionally unacknowledged accounts, as the following chapters will catalogue. These stories are frequently steeped in indigenous superstitions, in the occult journey of African geomancy and Latvian transcendentalism into Dhaka, in bizarre military cover-ups north of the archipelago, and ancient and mystical raptures that span western and southern continents. Perhaps destined by the stars, Babu was continually led down enchanted and inexplicable pathways, though it must be admitted that there is very little separating the fantastic from the quotidian in Bangladesh. The Jatiya Sangshad Bhaban obviously serves, and that has been a reading of the novel as well, as an allegory for Bangladesh. Like Bangladeshis, and I'm quoting from the novel again, like Bangladeshis are imprisoned kings. Babu knew in times of uncertainty he would gain much from considering closely the waters of the Sangshad Bhaban to catch its diamond like reflection of a clearer Bangladesh, one more lovely and blessed. So, this national allegory portion is very strong here. But there is more. And here I go into the weird. And this comes out through the narrator's kind of reflections on Louis Kahn's mystical inclinations. It merges postmodern architecture with African geomancy. And there's, of course, the secret society, the Sangsad Bhavan group. And in fact, in weird fiction too, one can also find out a lot of connections with secret societies. Even in Light at the End of the World, there's a secret society that moves from the margins to the center, almost like an allegory of the Hindu right moving from the margins to the center. So there's this secret society conspiracy fiction. That's where the kind of hybridization of this happens. And this, of course, happens in Babu Bangladesh as well, where the Sangsad Bhavan group, unlike Light at the End of the World, right, doesn't kind of allegorize the capture of power by the Hindu right, but a more emancipatory potential which exists in the Bangladeshi nation state. So that's the opposition. Let's talk about Louis Kahn and mysticism. In the movie made by his son Nathaniel Kahn, Khan's interest in mysticism and myth is repeatedly emphasized in his writings and also in the film made by his son titled My Architect. The circle, especially as an important Ghanaian aesthetic feature, plays a big role also in the architecture described in the Sangsad Bhavan in Babu, Bangladesh. Khan's career took a decisive turn after he got inspired by ancient ruins. And the irony, and I quote from Babu Bangladesh, the Pakistani Air Force admitted in 1976 that the only reason they had not bombed the work in progress was they had mistaken Khan's side for decrepit ruins. This was indeed a testament to his realization of an archaic acropolis. Again, post-modernity and what one could call the emancipatory dimensions of a long durée past come together, for instance, in this recasting of Louis Kahn and his interest in mysticism. So here's the what ifs, the speculative principles. For Babu Bangladesh, after Babu sees an Egyptian obelisk with hieroglyphs, and this is Louis Kahn on the side, Babu apprehended that these alphabetic figures represent the site of the Sangsad Bhavan itself. Babu came to affiliate Khan's three-dimensional colossus with the African praxis of reading the future. And this is where a long section on African geomancy also comes into the novel. Again, thinking about the hybridization of the weird with other traditions, so to speak, right? So let's think a little bit about the subjunctive notion here. The Bhuban is not only an allegory for the failure of idealism that undergirds the national imaginary, but a visionary herald of alternative futures. And I quote from the novel again. I backtracked to Muzarul Islam and how he fought with all his influence to complete the assignment. I read about how Islam had initially approached Albert Alto and Le Corbusier with the commission, but hands had twisted fate so that the task was Khan's instead. Those who wield these hands know that Khan's genius included in the identifying potential in others and orchestrating teams towards a vision. And in fact, when Babu walks through the Jatiya Sangshad Bhavan, the corners hum with music from different spheres, with electromagnetic kind of emissions and so on. So the corner becomes in some ways a portal to others outsides, alternative futures, so to speak, in some ways. Therefore, let me go back to the representation of deep and mythical time in the novel. I quote this novel, something from the end again. To chart Babu's life and his leaving, we must look into the days of human history, into its darkness, its dark green emerald, and into its brilliance and daylight. We'll resist certain visions. There will be much to reconsider, rearrange, and to file away for future returns. To measure the past, even when it does not wholly belong to us, is a tedious thing. We inevitably find ourselves in the belly of intimate moments we thought long since disappeared. We will awaken inside desolate crypts populated by forgotten demons that roam untethered. If we are able to bear these most harrowing of reckonings, we'll be rewarded with new growths and peace and light. Here's the inversion of the weird again. We will awaken inside desolate crypts populated by forgotten demons that roam untethered. However, if we are able to bear these most harrowing of reckonings, we'll be rewarded with new growths and peace and light. And in fact, let's think a little bit about peace and light here as well. And here, I don't want to talk about tentacles, but like Deb, talk about wings. Early on in the building section, there's a plot to destroy the Sangshad Bhavan by the Huji, an Islamist group in 1999, which is foiled when time comes to a standstill and an enormous winged form glides majestically over the conspirators. Captured in grainy video, a witness later says it's like the Al-Qamra, the splitting of the moon on the Day of Judgment, which is from the 54th Surah. The colors were funny and the air looked like something from another world. So the plot is foiled by this winged being, and in fact, winged beings like the rock, or for that matter, Fariduddin Attar's Conference of Birds, is constantly referred to over and over again in the novel as well, right? Babu disappears at the end of the novel, and it's insinuated that he becomes a bird. Flight here becomes a mode of transcendence, which is transcendare, to climb above and beyond. Could this be the transcendent instead of the abyssal outside? It is the final reversal of Lovecraft. I won't talk so much about Fariduddin Attar and the Rock, but let's focus now on the Yazidis. And the reason I want to do that is that there is a speculative history of the Yazidis in Babu, Bangladesh. It gets represented in three ways in the novel. The portrayal of the saintly YS, who was Babu's mentor in later life, it is insinuated that he's a Yazidi. The narrator meets with the polymath Sheikh Mafassal in Romania, where he learns about Yazidi movement across the globe, including possibly to Dinajpur in current Bangladesh. And then, of course, there are narratorial statements like, what a time it must have been, the 1300s, with scholars and saints of countless hues, each selecting their wings. And notice the wings, and choosing their horizons. Time was populated by 1,001 believers, with people worshipping and loving in an abundance of ways, but even so, worshipping and loving all the same. So it seems almost, if you think about it, people worshipping and loving in an abundance of ways. It is, to go back to the three novels, the foreclosure of an abundance of ways in this kind of neoliberal right wing present, which these emancipatory kind of imaginaries try to open up. But the reason I want to focus on Yazidis is we go back to the horror at Red Hook. We talked about Victor LaValle, but I didn't read out what Lovecraft said about the Yazidis, right? Most of the people, this is Lovecraft again, he conjectured were a Mongoloid stock originating somewhere in or near Kurdistan. And Malone could not help recalling that Kurdistan is a land of the Yazidis, last survivors of the Persian devil worshippers. And we know, of course, about Yazidi persecution by the ISIS as well. But this idea of the Persian devil worshippers and so on, which is, of course, very strongly there in this very racist, weird story by Lovecraft. Now, if you look, for instance, at the spiritual beliefs of the Yazidis, they believe in, let's say, a bird called Tawusi Malek, which, according to Himdad Mustafa, is a widespread legend about the peacock Maleke Tawus among the Kurds. The sacred bird was supposed to bring happiness to people. But centuries passed, and this magical bird did not appear. Some archer shot down the peacock's wing, they said, and the peacock remained somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the seas. Gradually, the Kurds came to the realization they had to fight for their own happiness. Again, the notion of futurity is connected with the winged kind of form. And this is Babu Bangladesh's closure. Babu and YS disappear mysteriously while being chased by lawmen after a heist. And I quote, the officers rushed into a building and were directed to the roof by groundkeepers. Once the detectives reached the roof level, they smashed open a jammed door to find themselves in a completely vacant concrete space. The three sergeants publicly referred multiple times to having seen two enormous birds, is this the Taus Himalek, fly from the summit of 23 Ring Road just as they smashed their way onto the landing. So, to kind of summarize, right, you have the Condylactis gigantea, the tentacular being, right, which becomes a portal to the past, the emancipatory dimension of the past, which is foreclosed. You have, of course, angels and tentacles in the light at the end of the world, but you also have these flying beings, the Tawasi Malek, which maybe in some sense kind of gestures towards a transcendent outside, something which might be an alternative to the very iron cage of the neoliberal iron nation form. And I kind of end with Deb as a final word, and this is from my interview with him. And so, in opposition to the instrumentalization of air and atmosphere, to pollution, capitalism, and the Anthropocene, angels and flight, tentacles as well, and the atmosphere represent for me the possibility of escape against the certainty of capture. And that is what novels like these are obsessed with. On the one hand, the certainty of being trapped or being fixed, of the end of the world, and on the other, the possibility always of escape and flight and light. And I'd like to end with that. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much, Sabine, for the invitation as well.
Uh, Thank you so much, Amit. This was truly enlightening, um, and uh, something really new for me. Uh, yeah, uh, I didn't get that.
No, I did get. I don't know if you got
Okay.
that. Sorry. Mhm.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Because looking at a lot of things, was making a lot of notes here.
Mhm.
um, you know, um, the term atmoterrorism,
Mhm.
and how relevant that is. You were talking about Delhi, and it brought, and I thought about Lahore
Absolutely.
on the other side of the border, and it has the same issue. And uh, you know, uh, uh, the air that is, that is being polluted. So, um, and also just looking at my some of the things that you said, cosmic horror and uh, human insignificance. Um, and it reminds me of, the caveman analogy, when the caveman goes out, the bright light of the sun scares him and he goes back. So yeah, you know just a few thoughts that came into my mind. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of this, of course, comes from teaching these novels as well, which I teach here at the University of Oklahoma, both in my graduate and undergraduate classes. But part of what happens here, I think, is not only like a critique of neoliberalism, which is going on in all the three novels, right? I mean, it is a critique of neoliberalism, how the state gets hijacked, let's say, by religiously extremist ideologies, right? On the one hand, one could also say in the Dominican Republic, right, the kind of very anti-queer politics, which is very, very strong, and a kind of resuscitation of, let's say, a queer emancipatory vision, which is also foreclosed. So these are kind of like sovereign states that constrict what one could call the possibilities of life, right? And this has both metaphorical and real dimensions. Let's think about air, something that we take as so natural, something that we breathe in, something that we don't think about. But the fact that, you know, when we talk about industrial pollution, when we talk about wildfires, it makes air appear to us like an alien entity, right? It really, and I mean that's why I found Deb's essay on Bhopal. It's called An Alien Visitation, right? Which is in Twilight Prisoners. So fascinating in the sense that think about a night where what you take for granted turns against you, right? That the fact that the air that you breathe, or in Indiana's case, the water, for instance, which is a source of life, now has become a space for death, right? A chemical spill, which could go back, for instance, even to oil spills in the Caribbean and so on, which kill so many lives and so on, right? And it's not only something that impacts, let's say, humans, but it also impacts non-humans, right? So I think even Delhi, the air, whether it's the heat or the air, the vultures falling dead from the skies, the news reports that we were hearing last year, that exhausted and dehydrated birds, how they were falling out from the sky, so to speak, in some ways. So there's a way in which the reality which is being described, so to speak, in these novels, in a certain way, is all too very realist and quotidian, but it is also alien, strange, and weird, right? I mean, I like that Victor LaValle statement, for instance, when he talks about police violence against black men, right? What cosmic indifference, right? At the end of the day, it's people who are indifferent to each other. Think even, for instance, the indifference that we are seeing about the genocide in Gaza now, right? In some ways, the indifference of people to actually seeing a live stream genocide being carried out in front of our eyes. So, in a way, reality has been weirded, so to speak, right? Whether it's in the human dimension of killing human lives, whether through spectacular or slow violence, but also how it extends, so to speak. And that's what the Anthropocene is. At the end of the day, in the way in which what we take for granted, it's not only about relationships with, let's say, animals or plants or so on, but elements that we take that are essential for life, air, water, heat, temperature, so to speak, even those have become alien, right? And I think what is the register through which we capture that? These are very ambitious novels. These are big novels, although Tentacle is not, the length is not very big. Its ambitiousness is. I mean, I just love these ambitious novels in a way in which it's not simply talking about, let's say, the birth of the nation or the destinies of a nation like magic realism did with Midnight Children. It's talking about everything all at once, right? Like it's talking about the nation state, it's talking about the planet, it's talking, and what kind of specific representational register do we find for that? Right. And I think that's where the weird comes in, the Lovecraftian weird. The other obverse of it, of course, is that we still find these dimensions for further life, maybe in traditions that have been suppressed. right? So in all of them, for instance, whether it's the Afro-Caribbean heritage, whether it's like the kind of residual ghostly presence of the Tainos in Rita Indiana's Tentacle, whether we think, for instance, about how in Hindu fundamentalist India, Islam is now being projected as the alien other, right? And Deb actually taking the Burak, so to speak, as an emancipatory kind of imagination, so to speak. Or when we go to Bangladesh, when, for instance, Numair Atif Chowdhury is actually talking about, let's say, Manasa Devi cults, or for that matter, even the indigenous practices of the Hajongs, because there is a strong indigenous presence in Bangladesh as well, which hardly ever comes in. So there are these emancipatory dimensions of life which are existing side by side with this destruction. It's both, in some sense, the capture of life, the possibility of flying away from it. And I think that's what the global South weird captures more than anything else.
And just thinking out loud here, because
Mm.
all this is actually still new for me. But you're talking about, can we say, or just thinking that maybe this, uh, how I'm interpreting it is a cosmic reaction to climate change, and we're talking about far right and all these things. Uh, can we say that? You know, like when we're talking about air, we're talking about water, kind of rebelling or reacting to bring some sort of sanity. For us, it
Yeah.
may be weird. Just thinking out loud here.
Look, there are two ways of thinking about it, in the sense that that's why I quoted the Amitav Ghosh section, which is in a way toying with the weird. I mean, Ghosh actually does some interesting stuff in Calcutta Chromosome with this. He also does some interesting stuff in Gun Island with this, but he doesn't quite think about the transformative potential of this, right? Think, for instance, about the shipworm sequence. Why do the shipworms, for instance, or what are called the teredo worms, why do they come up in Venice? It comes up because of global warming, right? I mean, in fact, there's a sequence in the novel which talks about that, and how, for instance, it's eating through the wooden pilings, right, that sustain Venice. And for him, it simply becomes as if the tentacles are coming out from the earth, in the sense that you're talking about. It's the earth getting back, trying to look at the human as the alien. But then it simply becomes a scene of horror, and then he does not quite look at the transformative potential of it. And one of the reasons why I like both the New Weird as well as the Global South Weird, which of course is my own invention, it is a term that I'm bringing up because I'm bringing these novels into conversation, is that I think there is a kind of way of thinking about an other side as well, something more emancipatory, simply more than, let's say, the earth getting back at us and so on, which in a way it is, right? I mean, one could definitely say that this very anthropocentric Cartesian idea of kind of dividing the human from nature, thinking about nature as natural resources only, right, is precisely what has led us to the problem in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
and also,
Mm.
and you please do continue.
Yeah.
Another thing that came to my mind, maybe we're the aliens, because
Yeah.
nature, it has been there for, we are, we came in late,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
maybe we're the aliens.
And one could say even that, the idea through which people, even theorists like Dipesh Chakraborty and all, talk about the Anthropocene is to think, for instance, not about humanity per se, but species activity as something non-ontological and alien, right? I mean, one way of thinking about it is that a very common simplification of the Anthropocene is that, oh, yes, we are again talking about human centrality and so on and so forth, right? No, but the point here is not so much about human centrality alone, but it is how the cumulative effect of human activity becomes a force that is no longer chemical or biological, but it is geological, right? So if, for instance, I you blast a nuclear bomb in Pokhran, that nuclear signature is there in the soil, right? The same goes, for instance, all about the numerous U.S. explosions, for instance, in the Pacific Island, how entire islands have literally been decimated, how it lives, for instance, in the bodies of Marshallese Islanders, and also science fictional scenarios like I was reading this kind of like which seems weird if one were to put it, the fact that, for instance, nuclear waste is stored in Arizona and there are 70 signs in 70 languages, which is kind of oriented towards the future reader, because the half life of nuclear radiation is 25,000 years. Maybe none of us will be present then, but someone, we assume, will still read those signs and recognize the danger. That's a science fictional scenario, but it's kind of like a imprint of human presence, so to speak, into the future, right? And I think that's I mean, when you talk about the alien visitation in that sense, right? I mean, you could play with it in so many different ways. I would definitely say here that one of the misconceptions sometimes about the Anthropocene concept, and of course, it is in a way deeply problematic as well, because obviously it thinks about the human species as one, not thinking about the carbon emissions of the richer countries versus the poorer countries and so on. I mean, we definitely know about those serrations, those critiques, and so on. But in a certain way, human activity is the alien object coming here, right? While we have looked at the alien outside, maybe that's the reversal, and that's the uncanny reversal at the end of Annihilation as well, right? What is the uncanny, right? Reverse the gaze, right? Maybe it's just the narcissism of the human. I love that line. I mean, I teach this novel. It's a creepy novel, right? But it grows on you. But there is this transformative ethical dimension in the novel at the end, where it talks so much about the narcissism of the human gaze. Maybe that is uncanny, but reverse it around. But maybe it's just a way of life here, right? And I think part of what the Anthropocene has also made us aware of are these kind of other perspectives, right? Are these other perspectives, other than human perspectives, so to speak, in some ways, that we are not the only ones looking and sensing, but others are looking at us too, or sensing us in some ways. So
Absolutely,
maybe we are the
absolutely,
alien in that sense, definitely.
absolutely. And yes, I agree. We might just be specks, in
Mm,
a really large galaxy.
mm,
Uh, but this narcissism of the human gaze, and I love this line, is,
mm,
you just, shared a beautiful line with me. And it absolutely, our pompousness.
mm. No, I mean, in a way, one could say that's the kind of centrality, right? I mean, part of it also comes, and I would say that while it's a definite strand of thinking in post-Cartesian philosophy, which is often called Western philosophy, but it is also there in certain forms of Eastern philosophy as well, or whatever we call the East, right? Which is, of course, such a kind of massive space in some sense. While there are dimensions both in what's called the West as well as what we call the East, which I think of even of a novel like the Khasi writer Janis Pariat's Everything the Light Touches, which is a beautiful novel about trees. I just wrote about it in my book, the book that is coming out very soon. But it makes an interesting connection between Goethe and his biological theories, right? And indigenous philosophies like Robin Wall Kimmerer, a kind of global, and it's this kind of conversation. So even within certain tradition, there are always modes like Spinoza and so on, just which could be in some ways conversing with, let's say, decolonial philosophies and so on, right? So this way in which, in some sense, a more kind of emancipatory future could be taught, and that's where I think someone like Numair's kind of research, so to speak, about the multiple histories that make Bangladesh into Bangladesh, as opposed to the official statist history, right? Whether we call it as a secular nation, an Islamic nation. The same goes with Siddhartha's thing about, the Indian context, because part of it, think even about the developmental regimes, for instance, in the global south, right? Sylvia Wynter, who's the famous kind of Caribbean philosopher, says very interestingly that, oh, let's not forget that the period of the great acceleration, right, after the 1950s, is also the period of decolonization, right? And a lot of post-colonial elites, right? The West comes and says, right, become homo economicus like us, economic man like us. And that's where the fetish for development. I mean, think even about Modi coming to power with all these stupid things about development and so on, right? Like in 2014, India will become this next so on and so forth, whatever that means. But this ideology of development, which puts into shade many of the other ways of thinking, which are also there in anti-colonial philosophy. And I don't mean only Gandhi, because everyone keeps on going back to Gandhi and so on. But there are so many of these other alternative ways, which are both what can call anti-colonial and decolonial at the same time, right? And I think these possibilities were always there, but these are possibilities that were missed. Just like Siddhartha, for instance, says that the Bandung project is, in some ways, a possibility that is missed, right? It is, in some ways, also a way of thinking about solidarity among what we call the third world, right? It's a possibility that probably still exists, but it is somehow so suppressed. I mean, Gaza is a classic example of that, right? So that's the dimension that we're thinking about in some ways, right? These emancipatory
And
dimensions that
and
exist on the side. Sorry.
um, w- one last question I wanted to ask. I'm just thinking, um, we're in conversation about decolonization. Um, we do we need to, and I think we need to think about decentralization as well,
Mm.
because what has this centralist view uh, given us? It has given us climate change and the man-made and uh, natural disasters and man-made disasters. So, how do you respond to that?
Absolutely. In a way, one could even say that it is the question of centralization and hyper-centralization, if one were to think about it. Whether we think of it even through the destruction of federalism, for instance, in the Indian context, to just give an example, right? This hyper-centralization with the strong state at the center, right, is probably one of the most anthropocentric ways, so to speak, about the notion of the human and its connections with whatever we call the non-human. It is, in some sense, a colonization of life, right? And I would definitely say that's the kind of you know, that's why Sylvia Wynter's point about saying that at that moment, right, at the dawn of independence of many of these nations, the West comes and tells us, become Homo economicus, and we became Homo economicus, right? So, in some sense, it's the idea of the human as the Homo economicus, which I think, in some sense, is also coming back into these kind of rigidly centralized state structures. And we see that, so to speak, in the context of China. We see that in the context of India. I mean, let's forget the West for the moment, but in a way, this kind of idea of hyper centralization, so to speak. But side by side with that, right? And here I'm not simply talking about federalism or decentralization in that sense. These alternative imaginaries exist. I come from Northeast India, right? Where historically people have always been skeptical about the Indian nation state, right? And I grew up in a circumstance like this, right? And of course, I still see, for instance, in quote unquote border regions, alternative forms of life existing. Like you might have the border between India and Bangladesh, but where's the border? There's the river. People are actually transporting things across the river, and they've done this for a while. Even though states have changed, they're still doing it in certain, right? It's focusing on those moments, right, when that centralization breaks down, where, in some sense, multi-faith communities, I, I hesitate to call it syncretic, multi-faith communities, so to speak, live together, where, in some ways, hybridized forms of life exist. I think a lot of these novels are trying to capture that. That hey, look, there's a foreclosure. It could end in this way. Just like, for instance, the trans character chooses to live as a white cis male at the end. He doesn't change the future, right? It's a foreclosure of the future in Tentacle. But here's a possibility that still exists. Maybe the whole imaginary is to push you in that direction of thinking about these imaginaries as well. These alternative imaginaries. They exist parallelly, side by side, so to speak, in some ways. Or even
Thank you so
over and
much.
under each
Yeah,
other. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. No. Uh, this was a delightful conversation,
Thank you so
and
much.
key takeaway is the narcissism of the human gaze.
I love that. I love that
Yes,
statement.
yes,
I'm actually
absolutely.
just taught this semester to my class, so it's going to come to the exam as a kind of identification passage. So I just think about that passage. It's just when I read that Annihilation, the movie is pretty bad though. I don't know if you've seen the Natalie Portman movie. It kind of
No, I
completely
haven't,
obviates that.
but I'm
It's
going
got
to
an
watch it
interesting,
now. But I'm
yeah.
going to still watch
But
it
the
now.
book is so much more. more interesting in that regard in terms of this metamorphosis and narcissism of the human gaze. So I always sticks in my head. One of my favorite lines in literature.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amit, for
Thank you
this
so much.
wonderful session.
Sure.